Hello everyone. I would like to welcome you to a little series of videos that I'd like to do in the pursuit of defining some terminologies. More so locking in terminologies. Many words in our lexicon do have a lot of various different kinds of meanings, and through my writings I've come to wanting to lock in terminologies just so that when any kind of a term or a name or a word is used, the people listening would automatically know the meaning of the word. Today, what I'd like to do is work on two terms. One is matriarchy and the other one is patriarchy. I'm going to build this from bottom up, and I will be using the writings that I did in my work called Forces of Society. It's a book that you can download and read the entire build-up of our cultural systems from bottom up, starting from matter over biological systems and then into cultures. We're going to start this journey of what it means to have matriarchy and patriarchy from the individuals and their direct interactions. Now, I will define these circles with these bubbles as conditionings. It will be apparent why that is throughout my writing. As for now, just assume that every time you see one of these circles, that'll represent either your conditioning or somebody else's. When two people find themselves around each other, there is, according to John Gottman's research, 3 ways you can interact or bid with one another. One of them is to bid away, which means to basically not engage with the person in any way. And I've called that interaction disassociative. And that could be either anywhere from changing the topic or just simply not engaging with one person at all, even if they're in the room. Another 2 ways to engage is to either bid forward, which is to want to connect with the person and have some kind of a interactive and building relationship. But also person can go against another person's bid, which is also interactive. So those 2 ways of interactiveness are defined as bidding toward versus bidding against, and both of those maintain relationships. So those are the 2 kinds of ways of interacting that I'm going to be focusing in this, because this associative essentially removes the relationship entirely. But the other 2, the interactive ones, they keep the relationships going. Right? You might have seen this next graph in the past. I've created a version of it, but basically what it describes is how one can be adjusted within a society with other people. It defines how we have a relationship with ourselves as well with others in a sort of a quadrant situation. In this case, the x-axis will be where your standing is with yourself in terms of how you bid with yourself, as we were talking earlier with the 3 ways of bidding. Okay, now I've purposely put that on the x-axis because you can actually very easily think of it as left and right, which will translate itself to a large degree into matriarchal and patriarchal society that emerge directly through our behaviors. Then we will have the relationship between the other person. The simple way is to explain it through trust. And when you think of yourself not trusting yourself, think of that more as in you're outsourcing your trust towards somebody else in the society, because this quadrant is a societal or interactive quadrant. Not trusting myself and trusting the other person will create an interaction dependence between 2 people. And those I'll call dependent temperaments, as in if I'm the person who doesn't trust myself. Because you have to remember that for each one of these quadrants that you can draw for yourself, you can draw for the other person as well. In this case, the other person may or may not trust themselves, and they may or might not trust us. So their quadrant with us even, or anyone else, will be different from our quadrant with that person. In this case, we perceive them as someone we can trust. We perceive ourselves as someone that we can't trust. And as a result, we will be putting ourselves into a dependent situation with them. If it so happens that we trust ourselves and we trust the other person, that's usually considered a healthy zone of wanting to associate with somebody who trust themselves to enough of a level that the relationship is mutually trusting. And these kinds of interactions can be thought of as leadership temperaments, or sort of like a friendly strength. Good parent is another word. Optimistic. Sanguine it's an older word. I've put them at the bottom because I'm not too familiar or interested in them. Phlegmatic would be on the dependent stage. Now, once we step into the don't trust you, and notice that I've purposely again put this on the left and right about ourselves, so that we have the left and right sense within ourselves, and then there's the bringing the person closer to ourselves or pushing them away from ourselves. So when you look at this diagram, think of it that way. So as a result, if I don't trust the person, I've pushed them away. Now, if I happen to not trust myself and don't trust the other person, that can be termed as hostile weakness. And then choleric irritable is the more kind of formal term for it. If I don't trust the other person, but I trust myself, then we can get ourselves into a situation where we, in a way, can dominate over them. Us not trusting the other person, even though we trust ourselves, doesn't mean that we'll necessarily have a healthy relationship with them either. That's why it's sometimes called the tyrannical zone of interaction, where one can have a strength, but it's sort of a hostile strength, because we can almost resent the other person because we don't trust them, and it can go in all sorts of psychological directions. Okay, I'm just setting up the kind of generic term, and now we're going to go into the details of what I mean by temperaments that we built around this. Personality traits and temperaments are actually what comes out of our own biology. Each one of us is born with a whole range of traits and temperaments that will serve us in various ways, in life or in survival in the world. These specific temperaments that I'd like to explore right now are particularly societal temperaments. So something that we were born genetically with to be able to maintain our relationships with the individuals in our, let's say, immediate tribe, if you will, or community or family, or however you want to term the single group system that we get born into. I will call this the interpersonal circumplex of temperaments. Okay, and it's a diagram of one's temperamental adjustment within a societal group, or social societal conditionings. Okay, the x-axis will be submission versus dominance. So one person will strongly submit or strongly dominate. Okay, so it'll be one's trust towards oneself in the group, so within the group. Okay, and then x-axis affiliation versus animosity. Okay, so this is how much we want to trust the other person and essentially affiliate with them, or we might not trust them, even if they're within our tribe, which will create a certain dose of animosity towards them. And this basically outlines our trust towards others in the group. And for every person in your group, you can draw this kind of diagram. So and then as a result, there'll be, say, if there's 100 people in the community, or 50, there's going to be a certain amount of these, let's say, charts for each person that will define, be almost similar to a large degree because of our general temperaments. What I mean by that is we might be leaning on one or the other side just by nature, and as a result will behave accordingly, biologically, really. We also might have been trained through, say, like some harsh discipline to be a specific other way, like, the discipline to just be polite with people and all that doesn't necessarily come naturally, but it can become natural if it's nurtured into us, because we all have the capacity and potential to do it. So as a result, if it's properly fed into a person, or a person's educated in that direction, they'll actually show those temperaments much more strongly. So let's have a look at some of them. What happens in the zone where we, let's say, not trust ourselves and want to strongly submit to the other person, and we find the other person is someone that we strongly trust, the balanced way is to not go extreme in any direction. That's going to become pretty obvious very quickly. So if we're lightly submissive, because it's always a combination. We might have a certain dose of trust in ourselves and a certain dose of not trust, depending on circumstances of the subjects or work or what have you. So if we're slightly submissive and we slightly trust the other person, then we'll be more like self-critical of ourselves or in the situation with the other person. And notice that each one of these temperaments, because they're social temperaments, they will actually have a preposition. So there's always going to be a connector to whatever the noun is or the person is. Okay, if we become very submissive, then we'll just be more obedient, and then if we trust them even more, they will start to be grateful for them, and we'll express that in many different ways. If we strongly, really, really trust the other person, we run the risk of becoming dependent on them. This is where extremes start to shine. And then gullibility can come with us wanting to just submit no matter what. Even if we fully trust them, it could be tricky for us just to put too much trust into anyone. That would be the dependent temperament corner, okay? And again, like affiliation in this case can be interest, it could be friendliness, it could be trust, it could be a full-blown love between two people, okay? And we'll be bidding towards those people in Gottman terms. And submission will be obedience, weakness, but weakness more as in, maybe we're wanting to rest. It doesn't have to be a negative term. Instability, similarly, just not stable right now. It's basically when we say, I'm not okay, I cannot support myself, and then we either bid away or against oneself. And notice how, in this case, the submission actually includes bidding away and against oneself. Now, if we trust ourselves a lot, that's where in the societal context, the social context, we will technically put ourselves into a dominance position with the other person. Now, remember that interplay between submission and dominance is in the game of both being egalitarian in a way where you negotiate with the other person of how much you're gonna dominate over them, but we also have the wiring in us to actually naturally, societally put ourselves into a position of power and having the other person submit to us. And to a large degree that comes from the fact that our young and our babies are so dependent on the parents that if we didn't have that instinct of being the manager of the small human that cannot take care of itself, it wouldn't survive. And they look for that dominance and to submit. So one can think of dominance as power, strength, and stability. It means I can support, and it means that one is bidding towards oneself. Okay? I'm like, I trust myself. So if in a societal structure we have individuals with whom we want to create affiliations, and we also want to have dominance as well. Now, have in mind that if we trust the other person, that means that we will allow dominance from them to come towards us. So you can basically think of it as wanting to hear other people's opinions of us or have the other people tell us what we should do. Now, if we have the dominance in ourselves, that means that we'll be doing the same thing. So in the course of the relationship or interaction, there's going to be some, let's say, healthy dose or some healthy balance between how much the other person listens to us and how much we listen to them. That creates basically responsibility for oneself, responsibility for the other. We become more considerate because we're listening to each other. If we have a lot of trust in ourselves, we'll be very comforting with the other person. And when it starts getting very strong, we'll be very friendly with the other person. And then the cases where it becomes a bit more extreme, one can think of people over-trusting, getting too over-trusting. So even though we trust ourselves and the other person trusts themselves, it is a good idea to also recognize that we're not always able to take care of ourselves. So if we're constantly in that habit of just assuming that we're both okay, that overtrust can actually become a problem just because you're not watching out for what could go wrong per se by putting too much trust. And then we got animosity, which is when the other person in the tribe we don't really trust. That can, create disinterest, dislike, distrust, hate all the way to. So think of it again as a scale of how badly it gets. Because again, this is one's trust towards oneself in the group, and this is one's trust towards others in the group. Okay? And when you don't trust somebody, you tell them they're not okay, they cannot support us, and we bid away or against that person. Now, if we happen to be in the world of where we just don't really trust ourselves, or we want to submit and have somebody else take, the charge, but we are, say, in a vicinity or engaged, or if we're in a social relationship of any sorts with somebody who we don't really trust, that will create various effects as well in terms of how our temperaments show. So as a result, we might just get a bit calm with the person, just because I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do with them, so I'll just try to avoid. We'll become, the strongly we don't trust them, the more indifferent we'll get with them. And then if we don't trust ourselves, we can get unkind, and then resentful, jealous towards, and then distrustful with. So all these different temperamental traits can develop themselves if we're in this quadrant. And then we've got when we don't like somebody else and we like ourselves and trust ourselves. That one will create the ability to be self-reliant from the other person. So we can take care of ourselves, the person can't take care of themselves, we'll just take care of ourselves. And then end up being unfriendly the more we untrust them, because I'm looking to be friendly with someone, but not that person. I have it in me to be friendly is the name of the game in this case. And then if we really trust ourselves and we're on somebody who we don't trust, then our ego can come out. We can become narcissistic and egocentric around them, and then become forceful on them the more or the less we trust them, okay? Or the more we distrust them. The dictatorial, dominant with. Okay. Now, this basically is the extent and the breadth of how much we can associate with anybody, and in which ways we can associate with somebody in a group. And I want to explore certain interesting factors with this specific system, how these things play themselves out in terms of sexuality and hormones, and how one was born from that angle. Okay? And that's what's going to take us in the direction of matriarchy and patriarchy. Okay? Here we go. So, I would like to define the terms right now. The word feminine and masculine. Okay? These are the first terminologies. Feminine and masculine would eventually lead themselves into matriarchy and patriarchy when it comes to societal governance systems, and whether more femininity or masculinity is driving the governing system. Okay? And what I'll pose is that the ability to be self-critical and calm and attentive and nurturing, more of feminine features in humans, and the ability to be, forceful and responsible, the ability to confront, to get things done, to get out there and just confront danger and trust oneself in that process, despite of anyone or how they are, I'll call them masculine. It's almost like you can think of it as your right hand is stronger than the left hand, and you are essentially, this is for the right-handed people. And again, this yet again outlines how it's always a game of percentages. And as I've always said throughout all my writing, if a specific emergence of anything expresses itself more than 68% of the standard deviation, as they say, I would call that as something that's an entity, that can be defined as an entity. And in this case, I would say that anyone who behaves on this spectrum more, I'll call masculine. And again, our right hand, people are born, by and large, most people are right-handed. So the left-handed, they just have to dyslexically flip the script on themselves with what I'm talking about. But essentially the dominant hand that you have, just like we have a dominant eye, we'll trust the dominant hand more than we'll trust our non-dominant hand. And that dominant hand will be the one that I would associate with almost like the masculine. You can punch with it, you can get stuff done with it, whereas the left hand can be used to tap someone on the shoulder. It can be used to console somebody. That's in the terms of how I think of this interplay between the left and the right. It actually plays itself perfectly into the feminine and masculine, as in we have both in us. And notice that there's always the idea of having balance between the two, which is my entire conclusion in this whole thing, is that the best arena, just like an atom, wants to stay. The electron always, the electron even with an atom is going around, but ultimately it loves its, let's call it safe zone, or its norm zone, or where it most likes to reside. Now, there's a university that a study where they actually defined a batch of terminologies or a batch of temperaments that they considered to be more feminine versus masculine. And there's, of course, a spectrum of this, as it turned out. It came through as a spectrum because, by and large, and by the way, someone being feminine doesn't necessarily have to be defined whether they're born male or female. And that goes for masculinity as well, because a lot of men can be very feminine and a lot of women can be very masculine. But they will all have a dose of femininity and masculinity within them. This also shows that one's sex in the way we were born doesn't fully define how the temperaments will play out in terms of how much feminine or masculine they'll have in their life. And again, we can societally train people to be more feminine or masculine. Tell men not to cry, or we can tell them to be in touch with their feelings. We can tell women that they're totally justified to cry, or we can tell them that they need to snap out of it. It can go any way, and the more you learn that and you're disciplined through childhood especially, the more it can define you as a person. And of course, if you have strong biological tendency in one or the other, and you're also pushed culturally through nurture into it, then you can really progress in whatever of these fields you want to go in. So in any case, we have this university basically define a dozen of different temperaments. And what they've noticed that the feminine temperaments were just by a larger percentage expressed in feminine people. Sensitivity will be a feminine trait, was a feminine trait, and most masculine individuals were not displaying as much sensitivity. They still had a certain capacity, so that's why I've made these two bubbles a bit different. I think the difference would have been, in this case, I would say, would start verging towards a standard deviation compared to what they have on the other side. So sensitivity was much stronger in femininity, and then it would go warmth, apprehension, tension, self-reliance. And notice here, self-reliance, liveliness, abstractness, perfection, privateness, how privacy is. Notice that all of these in the middle are actually very similar. They're almost the same, technically speaking. It's just that the differences get noticed as you go more into what are stronger feminine traits. And that's how it's defined. And on the outer spectrum, we have social boldness, openness to change, vigilance, rule consciousness, because playful left one that doesn't want to confront. There's many ways to think of this playful left feminine side, is that might not want to follow the rules as much. And that's why we'll see when kind of like the thought of conservatism comes in, politically speaking, the rules are going to be much stricter in the world of masculinity. Rule consciousness, emotional stability, and dominance. Okay? So these batch of temperaments were much stronger in masculine people than in feminine individuals, out of which the majority are women. So just think about this interplay between the feminine and masculine interaction with others in the context of how much we're balancing the two. And this brings us finally to the world of matriarchy and patriarchy. And that is that the world of matriarchy and patriarchy is one element of societal temperaments. It is in the zone of whether the person is guiding the other person's behaviors. Now notice that is called dominance. Basically, all of these traits that we have with others, dominance is just one element of how we interact with a person in terms of behaviors. It's basically passing on the idea of how I think one should behave onto that person, or them onto me. And from that angle, in that pocket right there, is where patriarchy and matriarchy lies. Say a tribe or a company or any kind of a group, a family setting, technically. I can say a larger extended family. And if within those 100 people we have a large dose of females that are in positions of making decisions, essentially in positions of power, they will come with a batch of their feminine traits that come within this quadrant and within each individual. And that could be a very understanding, very supportive environment, because again, we all have that dose in us, even if it comes from men and women. If it goes very, very extreme, then that's where the elements of canceling a person comes, or abandoning a person comes. On the other side, which is masculinity, there's the concept of wanting to have more order, more force in a way. And so if you have a tribe where out of 100 people mostly are males that are dominating, they will bring their male traits into the entire group and make it more patriarchal. So the previous one would have been more matriarchal. This is more patriarchal. It's just simple game of how many individuals are male or female that are playing the game of dominance, or making sure that they implement the memes onto the society and they hold their worldviews. So with their temperaments, they will actually put more discipline into the tribe, into the organization, into the family. And if they get out of hand, or it gets too strong or too extremely expressed, that's when punishments come up, and they can go all the way up to wars. To conclude, we have to think of matriarchal and patriarchal systems more in the context of which group just simply dominates. So when we say something is patriarchal, that doesn't mean that there's no matriarchy. It just means that the patriarchy is a bit stronger than matriarchy. That means that we have, say, 60 or 70 or 80% of males calling the shots, and then 20 or 30 females. And vice versa, where matriarchy comes in, and we call something matriarchy, that doesn't mean that it's only matriarchy. Again, if it gets into just women calling the shots or just men calling the shots, that for me is like just using one of your hands to do everything. And eventually the hand gets tired. You can expand this imbalance, or balance for that matter, from the physical acts of just using your hands to how you deal directly with somebody else or with yourself, all the way to how we treat an entire society and how we collectively create the world that we live in. And the best outcomes are when things are in balance. It's just simply how it works. If you get tired with using one hand, you switch. Similarly, a good balance between feminine and masculine, a good balance between matriarchy and patriarchy is what is needed. And from that angle, you can call it something like a equalarchy, right? I'll read a couple of passages from my book directly on this subject. A good usage of masculine can foster temperaments of confidence, productivity, critical thinking, and generousness. And the feminine will cultivate temperaments of curiosity, nurture, acceptance, and unconditional love. And here's another quote from my book directly on this point. Instead of having only matriarchy, where only mothers, that is, mater, as it's known as, they rule, which comes from the word archaea, or if whether something is only a patriarchy, where only fathers, coming from the word pater, have authority, perhaps we can have a bit truer equality from the word equalita and equita, where there's a suitable, healthy, and balanced societal dominance of each, and call it all a form of equilarchy or equilarchia. I also like to call this simply humanism. When you look at it from a human perspective, we don't think in terms of sex or any other traits that we want to dominate. If the society goes in the direction of needing and creating infrastructures for women to be in positions of power, that means that by and large the society can get itself, through nurture and through culture, used to encouraging women to be in positions of power. This is why the submission element goes away. So that means that they're pushing themselves in the masculine direction. When dominance is done by the feminine world, that's when women will actually start being nurtured into being more like men, and men will be nurtured into being more like women. On the other hand, when the masculine is in position of power, which it comes naturally for it, then the society will encourage men to be more masculine, which they technically, by and large, out of 1,000, there will be a standard deviation plus of humans that will take on the responsibility of dominating, which will not only biologically push the society into patriarchy, but also through culture, which will push the feminine, and the women will be more taught and encouraged and pushed into being more feminine, which by and large most women are. And that concludes the first segment that I'm recording out of the series on the topic of locking in terminologies and definitions. So from now on, when I talk about either feminine or masculine, or matriarchy and patriarchy in my presentations, this is what I'm defining it as. Again, I need to remind that many different people, academics, writers, might have their own angle on how they would like to see femininity and masculinity and matriarchy and patriarchy. I'm pretty close to the definition, generally speaking, but if there's any disagreement on the definition itself, I'd like to make sure that it's understood that this is how I understand it. I'm looking forward to define more terms, as I have dozens and dozens of terms that need to be locked in like this. So please watch those, and if you're interested, please purchase the whole book. You can find it on Amazon, you can download it on Kindle, you can download it directly from me on the culturarasa.com website. Thank you so much, and see you again.